hidden treasures of the 119th Psalm. Oh, I love this psalm and I love digging around in it. So, how fun. We get to do the fear of the Lord, that anointing from Isaiah 11 on the letter Ayin today, as we've talked about many times. In the 119th Psalm are the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and each of those we get 8 verses, and those 8 verses give us really 8 faces of God through that particular expression. With today, we're studying again the letter Ayin. And so with the idea of the Ayin and what we've talked about so far in this whole concept is God's vision. And so how cool. This verse, I'll read it in English and then we'll dive right in. It's verse 126. It is time for thee, Lord, to work, for they have made void thy law. Well, wow. Talk about leaning on the fear of the Lord. And let me just say that the next 2 verses, they're really connected to this verse, because you can see that he leverages this particular verse to go into the next 2 verses. And so without stealing the thunder for the next 2 episodes, we'll just stick with this one, because here we got essentially the psalmist is saying, man, I need you. Like, you can do this. Like, you're the guy. And it starts out with the word time. And I love that, it is time. I can hear that from the Lion King, movie. But, there's just comes a time when things have got to change. Like, you feel like this is it. I can't take it anymore. How that works, what that looks like. And the word time, as you might imagine, is an ayin. So that's the way that, again, all the verses are going to start with an ayin. And that this particular verse that starts with an ayin is the word time. So isn't it cool that the word time is this idea of God's vision, which that's the letter ayin, and then it ends with the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is a tav, which is essentially God's stamp, which God's stamp is on all time. But it's also that, this idea of everything's going to be all right in the end. So the neat thing about that word time is you study it in the scriptures. The first time you'll find it's in Genesis 8:11, and then back in Genesis 18, where the dove came in to the boat at exactly the right time when it had the olive leaf in its mouth. And he also said, when it was time of Sarah's life to have this child. So, there was a time, Abraham had been waiting a long time. When you think about it, Noah had been waiting a long time, right? If you think about it, Noah's been sitting in this boat wondering what in the world. And then when it was time, here comes this dove. And the same thing with Sarah, right? That right at this particular time. And so the psalmist knew this King David knew that it's time, okay? It is time. And so this has so much to do with the understanding that God has this. And then that word work. Again, it's time for thee, Lord, to work. Well, the word work, right, as you might imagine, because we've talked about how the ayin has to do with the word do. So the word work also starts with an ayin, and then a shin and a hey. And so it's the idea of actually God's vision being accomplished, or God's vision being oxidized as a letter shin. We'll study that here in a number of episodes, but it'll be a while before we get there. So it's time for thee, Lord, to work. For they make void thy law. In other words, they're breaking the law here, and it's time. It's time. And I can't help but to think of where God took me on this just today. I remember so vividly, I do a radio show called Lantern Rescue, where these amazing Christian men go around the world rescuing people from sex trafficking. And every once in a while I get a chance to interview some of the victims. And oh my gosh, I I remember this one poor girl. I can't even imagine all that she went through. It was so horrible. And I won't go into all the details, but I will tell you that Land and Rescue is another podcast, a wonderful podcast if you want to hear it, where you can hear these kind of things of what God is doing when people really need it, when it's time, right? And this poor girl, her father was selling her and abusing her with all his friends. It was unbelievable. They lived out in this ranch, and they had her out often in a field. They would tie her to a horse, where you would tie up a horse pole that was in this field. And just unthinkable. And she said she remembers one night laying there just totally like, how I can't take this anymore. And she looked up at the stars and she said, does anybody care? Can somebody please help me? Well, God did. God did it when it was time. And only God knows, why certain people suffer some unbelievable things. But when it was time, he came to the rescue. Like there was a teacher at school that noticed something about her, and then, she did some investigating that when they found out a little bit about what was going on, they actually put her in the foster home of a pastor. Unbelievable. And again, considering the trauma this girl's been through, it's unbelievable how God did work, but it was in his time, right? And so... the psalmist, and I'm sure you've been there. And in fact, I heard a testimony this morning of another young man who was struggling through all sorts of, of addictions. And he says he remembers going to bed at night just saying, help, help. And one time I interviewed Carter Conlon, who's the pastor at the Times Square Church. And if you hear his testimony, he was struggling with all sorts of things. And his simple prayer was just help, right? Because if we really can just get to this place of what this verse says, like, Lord, you're in charge of all the time, okay? And you know when it's time, and you know when it's the right time. And when it's time, you are going to do your work. Your plan is going to be fulfilled, right? And so, because we can see clearly these people they're breaking your law, which is breaking his heart. And but God is not willing that any would perish. And so he's got all these things figured out on what the right angle is and the right time and all these things as he is continuing to, for the best lack of a better word, refine, the burning fire that's refining, getting off the dross. And it takes a lot of heat because we got a lot of dross. So I think you can see the fear of the Lord in this verse, that anointing that's on the letter Ayin. It's time for thee, Lord, to work, for they make void thy law. Thanks for listening.